Glad that we could be here together, and we are going to be looking not at this week's Torah portion in this Torah study, but rather at Jewish ideas about reproductive justice and abortion, of which you can imagine there's lots of different kind of ideas within the Jewish tradition. We'll talk about that in a moment. Before we dive in, let's offer our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu לעסוק בדברי תורה, לעסוק בדברי תורה, הפוך בה, לעסוק בדברי תורה, ידעי די 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 די, ידעי די 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 די, ידעי די 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 די, ידעי די די די. Hi, Kim, welcome. And we are about to dive into this portion. Before we do, I just want to say a couple of things. We know that reproductive justice and abortion are extremely emotional topics, especially now. The purpose of this class here is for us to just kind of dive into what the rabbis and what Jewish texts have had to say over the years, so that maybe we can gain some more kind of just understanding of where some of the Jewish ideas are coming from. This is not a session that is geared to try to change people's minds on what they should and should not believe. This is really about understanding Jewish conceptions. It's also, we know the old adage, right? 2 Jews, 3 opinions. And while in Judaism, it's clear that there are circumstances in which abortion is necessary through Jewish lens, there's disagreement as to when those times are. So the rabbis argue with one another, talk to different values and perspectives, and we're going to wrestle with that ourselves as we look at some of these texts. So with that rather long caveat, let's dive in. Okay. We are going to start with something about the status of a fetus. One of the biggest things from the legislation coming out of the Supreme Court really is this argument over when life begins. And so the way it feels appropriate to start here is talking through when does life begin from a Jewish perspective. In Yevamot 69b, there's a text that says, and if she is pregnant, until 40 days from conception, the fetus is merely water. It is not yet considered a living being, and therefore it does not disqualify its mother from partaking of terumah. Now, the context of this and the partaking of terumah has to do with sacrifice, and I don't want to go into that whole piece here, but the point of this text is really just to say that a fetus isn't considered a real living being, according to this text, until 40 days from conception, which is different than 40 days into pregnancy, because pregnancy is based on a woman's last menstrual cycle, whereas conception is when the baby is actually conceived. So if we're talking 40 days, we're actually talking in the neighborhood of 54 days, which is what, about 8 weeks into pregnancy. And so just let's bring in one more text here, and then we can talk these through. Actually, before we even do, is that surprising to people, this text, or are you familiar with that?
I'm familiar.
Yes, surprising.
Yeah, the wording of merely water, I know, can feel a little bit alarming. And so we're going to talk through different ideas here on it. What I want to bring in is this text from Exodus from a few months ago, the Torah portion. And this is one where it's listing a bunch of different laws within Jewish tradition. And one of the things that comes up is, if you do something that hurts another person, what is your responsibility? So in the context of all of those conversations, we come to this. When two or more parties fight, and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according to the woman's husband, as the woman's husband may exact, the payment to be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise.
Jeffrey, I'm in class with Rabbi Cassi.
Hold on. There we go. Sorry about that, everyone. So what's going on in this text? How do you make sense of what's going on here?
How does the woman's husband determine the value, the amount that should be charged? Because it says according to the woman's husband may exact. I mean,
Right.
what's it worth?
Yeah, so there's two different things that I'm hearing in what you're saying, Michael, right?
Yeah, right.
One is the woman's husband being the one to exact a payment of some sort. This is coming from the notion that a woman belongs to her husband.
Yeah.
And her children belong to her husband. And that certainly is not the way most of us view things today, right? But this is from thousands of years ago. So we definitely need to understand it in the context in which it's written.
Yeah.
But there's another piece here as well. So a miscarriage results. We don't know how far into the pregnancy this woman was. We're not given any of those details. There's lots of questions about that, right? Is this early on? Is this actually very close to giving birth? Is the woman actually in labor at this point, as one rabbi puts out? We don't know the answer to that. But one way or another, there's this awful accident and there's a miscarriage. But what happens? There's a payment based on the worth of that baby. So what does that tell us about the status of the fetus? Yeah, go ahead, Steve. Oh, wait, you're muted. Sorry, you were on the phone, so I had to mute you. I apologize. Are you able to unmute?
He doesn't hear you.
There you go. Okay. Sorry about that. Every year when I read the same thing, I have come to the conclusion that it's obvious to me that the fetus has value, but not necessarily the same value as a person who's been born. So it's not like just removing a skin lesion that has no value. This has value, but not equivalent to a born person.
Okay, so it's not that this fetus is mere water, but it's not equal to a full baby that's been born. Yeah, Irv, go ahead.
Yeah, this is very similar to me as a civil suit against somebody who does not a criminal suit, but a civil suit.
Yes.
They owe you for damages.
Yeah, that's exactly the context here. So there are different texts where it talks about, if someone's limb is hurt or if something happens, all different circumstances and the kind of payment that is needed in a kind of civil suit. They didn't have that wording back then, but that is essentially what it is. Anyone else find anything in this text that you have questions about?
It also is pretty restrictive in terms of it's a marriage partner versus someone who's not married or not in a relationship. It's real specific here.
Right. And that also is very contextually based for its time, right? That a woman was the property of the husband. If there wasn't a husband, a woman really didn't have rights of her own. So that's very true.
And the woman's progeny is also the property of the husband.
Yes. And I want us to hold on to that and remember that, because we're going to need to go back to that in a little while when we look at a different text.
So I have a question, please. Am I just like misinterpreting this? But it says, but if other damage ensues, so all the, to us in the time that we live, the fetus is so important as a potential living person, but it seems like these are that the fetus is less important. I mean, it seems okay. So if a lady gets pushed off a balcony and she dies, then it's life for life. But if the eye for the eye, I mean, these are the other sort of quasi equivalences for damages that could occur. But apparently it wasn't that important during this period of time when they considered it like water, to give it more, well, as I said, the word importance, or I don't know. Am I not understanding what it's saying? It's puzzling to me.
Yeah, I mean, it's less direct is what you're getting to. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
I think what it says to me is that the woman's life is more valuable here, because the punishment seems to be greater if she is injured in some way. So that's what it speaks to me, that then it becomes more serious, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. So, if you break her arm, her arm is broken, then your arm will be broken, and so forth. So that's what I get out of it.
Here's an observation. What if the parties fighting, it's a man and a man? Then the issue of potential pregnancy or a fetus is totally irrelevant. So then it becomes a penalty, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. So in that context, if it's a woman and she is pregnant, but there's no apparent damage to the pregnancy, then it's treated just as if she were not a woman. That being the owner, the ownership being the man's, it's as if he's been attacked, and the punishment is the same as if a man had been attacked. And I don't think one other observation here, we tend to look at these things with a lot more knowledge than people did then. For one thing, infant mortality was much higher then. And they had no conception of a sperm cell joining an egg cell and cells replicating. We have a conception that there may be processes leading to life going on that I don't think people then had. It was a seed being planted, and while it was still in the ground, who knows what its condition was.
We definitely have some more medical knowledge now. Yeah, Eve, what did you want to say?
Well, I see this as the woman not having any rights here, and also I guess what I feel with regard to the miscarriage of, I don't necessarily, well, first of all, it doesn't say how far along she is in a pregnancy, which somebody else mentioned earlier. So I'm kind of seeing it as the price for his child. That's the way I see it. And then I don't even think he thinks it's her child, but his child.
Right, the ownership. In a lot of ways, it was viewed as the male's ownership. Absolutely. One really important thing that I want to bring in here that I think might help with some clarification is that often when we read the Torah, we read it word for word, right? It's saying eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot as a literal kind of idea. But the sages teach that it probably wasn't literal, that the underlying teaching here is not your foot is broken, so you break someone else's foot, but rather we should place ourselves in the position of the person who was hurt and have to give up something that is equivalent to that in some way, whether that's literal or not. Now, with the case of a baby, of a fetus being, miscarried because of an accident, well, if a male is bumping into this pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, there is no equivalent for the male, right? That's not something like you can't say, well, then the male also has a miscarriage. Like that doesn't make sense. So what is it saying? Well, a payment must be based on reckoning. There have to be something as a punishment, as a payment for. But this fetus does not have the same status as a limb, as a human life, as anything like that. It is something that is significant, something that is important, but it's something that is also different from those things. So it's just kind of clarifying ideas as we move forward. I'm going to bring us into one more text in this section, and this is also from the Talmud. So in Sanhedrin 87b, it says, in cases of capital law, the dispute concerning such a prohibition is with regard to the issue that is subject of the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and the rabbis, as it is taught in a baraita that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, with regard to that which is written, if men struggle and they hurt a pregnant woman, and if there shall be a tragedy, you shall give a life for a life. The reference is to monetary payment for the life that he took. The tragedy referenced is the unintentional killing of the mother. So that's going back to that earlier text, right? And here in the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides teaches one who strikes a woman and causes her to miscarry, even though this wasn't his intent, he must pay the value of the fetus to the woman's husband and damage and pain to the woman. This is our civil suit, right? It's kind of underlying what it is that we spoke about. And this last text, a fetus is considered as its mother's thigh, a part of its mother's body. And it is as though the master transferred ownership of one of her limbs to her. Since the maidservant is pregnant, the child is considered to be a part of her, and it is as though he emancipated a portion of her body. So what do you make of this very different idea, right? We've heard so far, a fetus before a certain amount of time is mere fluid. We've seen that there is this understanding of a fetus as being sacred, but different from body parts and from human life. And here we have this idea of a fetus as being considered as its mother's thigh. Any thoughts or questions based on that?
Well, I'm assuming maidservant is wife.
It's a little more complicated than that here, but
Okay.
yeah. But really the part that I want to focus on is this first part here.
Okay. Yeah.
What keeps coming to me is really, you're looking at the value the woman has to the man and the value that the fetus, which is not yet born, and so it cannot work. It cannot produce anything that would enhance the family, is in there. And that all of this is, well, if the fetus was, maybe 4 months along, that's not a great loss. If the fetus was about to be born, then it is a greater loss. If you look at the husband or just the man of the family, that children have value for what they are going to be able to do, men or women, or boys or girls, and what is their potential value to their family, and their potential value also, particularly for girls, is where they would marry.
Yeah. Oh, Fred, sorry. Can you unmute?
Okay. I was just seeing that in a sense, if the fetus is considered a part of the woman's body, it is not yet an independent entity. It is part of her body at this point, and the woman, or from the biblical perspective, the man as owner of the woman, would have the ability to make a decision about what happens to that part of her body.
Or how much it was worth, which is
Well,
kind
they're
of.
talking about how much it's worth, but I'm thinking also in terms of the person having autonomy to make a decision about it, in a sense.
Yes. And so here we have a little bit of a shift, right? The text that we had before this was all about the male being paid for the death of his fetus, right? It's his. And here there's something else that is going on. There's an ownership that's attributed to women, as you, Rabbi Catherine, and you, Fred, were talking about. There's a lot of different issues that come up when we're talking about reproductive justice and abortion, right? And we're going to go back to this idea of ownership and autonomy when we go a little bit further. Before we go into that section and take a brief hiatus just to look at this one text from the Shulchan Aruch, which is about access to healthcare. Because a big piece of this really is about making sure that there is access for people who need it, and that relates back to this idea of autonomy, right? So if we look at the Shulchan Aruch, Maimonides writes, the Torah has granted the physician permission to heal, and it is a religious duty which comes under the rule of saving an endangered life. If he withholds treatment, he is regarded as one who sheds blood, and even if there is someone else who can heal him, for not from everyone does one merit to be healed. Nevertheless, one should not occupy himself with medical treatment unless he is an expert, and there is none other greater than he. For if not so, he is regarded as one who sheds blood. So it goes down different responsibilities. But in essence, what it's saying is, if something can be done that will preserve human life, it must be done. One of the challenges that comes up with the ruling from the Supreme Court is that in some cases, it makes that treatment impossible. If there is a woman whose life is in danger and who's in pregnancy, if the focus is on saving the baby, then what happens? The woman can't get the treatment that she desperately needs, which puts both the baby and the mother's life at risk. And as we'll see a little bit later, because Judaism is so focused on the importance of life, that means that a full life always takes precedence over something that is not yet a full life. And since a fetus we don't know exactly what the status of a fetus is from those earlier texts, there's discrepancy there, right? But we do know that a fetus is not yet a full life in the same way that the pregnant person is. And so that's going to factor into things quite a lot. And that really is the deepest kind of reasoning on why the abortion bans that have been proposed are threatening to the Jewish tradition because of that discrepancy over whose life takes precedence. So, okay, there we go. Rabbi Hara Person is one of the heads of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, and she put out this article on the repeal of Roe versus Wade just last week. Does anyone want to read what she wrote here?
I could do it.
Thank you.
Just as a prohibition did not stop drinking, repealing Roe versus Wade will not end abortion, but it will harm our society's most vulnerable populations. It will make reproductive care inaccessible to the people who need it most, It will silence. It will silence the voices of those that go unheard in favor of those who speak out the loudest. It will create a system in which the government and religious fundamentalists have more control over women's health and bodies than the women's themselves do.
Okay, so again, this is going back to this idea of autonomy, right? Who can make the decisions? Is it something that should be handed down from a court? Or is it something that women and their doctors or their families do? Any comments or thoughts on this? I know that Rabbi Person is really good at getting to the core of what's going on.
Can I give my personal view?
Please.
Okay, I don't think any male, except any male, can have the final say over the pregnancy. And the only place they would have input if they're in a marriage or in a committed relationship, and then it's input. It's still the woman's choice. It's her body and her choice. And any connection to religious ideology is, we're supposed to be free from that in this country, but we're not.
So
religious freedom doesn't mean that we're free to force our religion on others, especially the government. It's freedom from religion to participate yourself. You have strong religious beliefs, that's fine. But I agree with her that the judges who are obviously ideological, they're all Catholics, 6 of them, and anyway, that was my view.
If I could add something to that, it seems to me there's really 2 sides to this whole thing. There's 2 aspects of it. One is that the Supreme Court repealed Roe versus Wade, but if they were operating perfectly, that decision would be based only on the Constitution. They're not empowered to make religious decisions on behalf of everybody in the country. So if we take it on the surface, the Supreme Court ruled that there is no right to this, covered by what was previously regarded as privacy, but also that there apparently is in the Constitution, as we all know, something that protects life, that everybody has the right to life. And so there is the presumption then that the unborn fetus is life. And I think that's the point of dispute here. The fact is some people believe that and some people don't. And the danger is that having had Roe versus Wade repealed, then we can have influential legislatures in 50 different states decide on religious grounds who is alive and who isn't. And so perhaps what really needs to be done is something has to be established saying, well, when is a fetus a person? When does it receive protection for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And when is it just a part of the woman's body? So she has a right to determine. I think in ancient times and even in more recent philosophical times, there was something to the effect that if the woman has right to terminate the pregnancy unless there's a quickening, and the quickening was, okay, does the baby kick? I guess. I mean, is this thing independently acting? And I think the decision was in part based on that, as if it were a historical recognition that the unborn person had a right to live. But I think that's going to be the crux of the matter. And the Supreme Court just said that every living person has a right to this, but when is a person living?
Yeah, there's so much in that, and we don't agree on those things, right? And I don't know that we're going to find consensus. It was not even fully consensus within the Jewish community. So all the more so when you bring in all of these different perspectives that people have. But I know that Steve and Frank want to say something. Please go ahead. Steve first.
I think that many of the people who are violently opposed to this decision are missing the important point that, at the risk of sounding like a constitutional lawyer, the Constitution was drawn because we had at that time just come out from underneath the thumb of a monarchy where the king had absolute authority over everything in our lives. The Constitution was drawn for the purpose of limiting federal government's powers. In the 10th Amendment, it specifically says that those powers which are not given to the federal government are to remain with the states. It's very clear. There's nothing in the Constitution about abortion. Therefore, the federal government should not be involved with it. It should be up to the states. And in so doing, if the states have authority over whether abortion, to what degree or not, is legal or not, the individual citizen has far more say in what happens than if it were up to the federal government, because you have a little larger voice in your state government than you would in the federal government. To me, it's abundantly clear. I don't understand why there's such a disagreement over the Roe v. Wade should never have been passed. It was based on the woman's right to privacy, which doesn't even exist in the Constitution. That's my speech.
So, I mean, I want to get us back from governmental structures here, because that's not the crux of what we're trying to get out. It's not a matter of whether the federal or the state government should make a ruling on this. It's more a matter of, should this be something that is decided through politics, or is this something that should be decided in a more personal way through one's personal faith, their doctor, their families, and so on? So yeah, Frank, please go ahead.
Okay. Hi, guys. Hi, everybody. My personal, and I think that a person gets our soul when we come out of the womb and we get that first good breath of God's Hesed energy. I think that's what I believe, and that's kind of what I've been shown in life. But on this topic of, and I do believe it's a growth inside of a woman. I absolutely believe, and we are going to trust a woman to care for this in her womb. Then I think she also has the good mindset to know this isn't a good environment outside of the womb to bring him in right now, or her in, right? I absolutely believe that. But on top of that, and what we were just talking about with the guy, with Hashem, is like, if we know that he is all powerful, almighty, he is one, then how dare us intrude in a person's decision that they have to have their own personal relationship to deal with that decision that she needs to make. I think that's so we're going to say that he can't take care of that fetus or soul, if they believe it is. Like, he's all powerful, almighty. Of course he can. That's not their deal to be involved when it's with a woman and her decision. So I mean, he's all powerful. He's almighty. He's going to take care of it. If it's a soul, he's going to send it back. Whatever. I believe that. So I think we're just trying to get involved with other people's decisions, because sometimes we're just so narcissistic here. We have to do that. So in America. Anyway, I'll shut up.
Thanks, Frank, for adding that in. I do want to go back to some of the comments in the chat, because there were some really good questions and comments. When we had talked about the story of the two people who were fighting and the woman had a miscarriage as a result, right? This question came up of, what if the perpetrator, what if the person who actually caused this miscarriage is the husband? What happens in those circumstances? And the truth is, the Torah doesn't get to that because it didn't have that on the mind. There is a story that comes up in the Talmud that is kind of a parallel in some ways of what happened in the book of Exodus, which is that there are two men, the husband and another man, that are fighting, that are hurting one another, and there's fear, and a woman comes into it and grabs a man's reproductive organs. And the response immediately is, okay, cut off her hand. That a woman doesn't have the right for defense. Even if something was happening against that woman, the woman wouldn't have a right to defend herself because of the view that it was in, which placed that woman in a much more precarious spot than even these texts indicate here. So there's a lot more that's kind of going on beyond the scenes that people were aware of. There are a few other things in the chat as well. Yeah, this question of, when is a person a person? And we're going to get to some more texts about exactly that. Oh, and Bonnie's great question about end-of-life care, which is a wonderful thing to dive into. I'm not sure that we're going to have time to do that today, but I really do appreciate that a lot. I want us to look at some of these texts because there's two different kind of views that come into this idea of, when does life begin? One is from Maimonides and the other is from Rashi. And Maimonides relates to this question of a parent's life being in danger. Okay, so he writes, this is a negative commandment, not to take pity on the life of the rodef, the pursuer. Therefore, the sages ruled that when a woman has difficulty in giving birth, one may dismember the child in her womb, either with drugs or by surgery, because it is like a pursuer seeking to kill her. Once its head has emerged, it may not be touched, for we do not set aside one life for another. This is the natural course of the world. So what is it that Maimonides is saying here about when life begins?
If the woman's health is in severe danger, then you have a right to terminate the pregnancy.
Right. So Maimonides says only under those circumstances, right? It's very stringent. Only in the circumstance where a woman's life is in danger, where it's possible that both the fetus and the mom could die, but that the mom's life is very seriously in danger. In that case, the woman's life takes precedence, period. Because a baby becomes a baby only once its head has emerged. That's what Maimonides teaches, okay? So his idea is fully around this idea of a rodef, that if this fetus, if the baby's life is in danger, it's because the fetus is like a pursuer trying to take its mother's life. That is how he's classifying things here. And we might have tons of different responses to that, but that's how he's trying to make sense of this. He feels really uncomfortable with the idea of an abortion because he sees something sacred in this being, in this fetus, right? And so is trying to justify in what cases an abortion would be necessary and actually morally important to follow through on. I want to bring in one other thing and then we can kind of debate these ideas. So this is also relating to the fetus being a pursuer. Rab Chisda raised an objection to Rab Huna from a Braita. That's just saying from this other text, they're debating something. If a woman was giving birth and her life was being endangered by the fetus, the life of the fetus may be sacrificed in order to save the mother. But once its head has emerged during the birthing process, he may not be harmed in order to save the mother because one life may not be pushed aside to save another life, right? We've already read that piece. If one is permitted to save the pursued party by killing the minor who is pursuing him, why is this so? If the fetus is a pursuer who is endangering his mother's life, the Gemara answers, this is not difficult, as it is different there with regard to the woman giving birth, since she is being pursued by heaven. Okay, so this is a different idea that's now being introduced. Maimonides said, well, the fetus is the pursuer who's trying to take her mother's life. This idea is, no, she's being pursued by heaven. It's not because of the baby. It's because there's something else that is going on here that is threatening the mother's life, okay? Since the fetus is not acting of its own volition and endangering the mother of its own will, his life may not be taken in order to save his mother. So there is this debate that's kind of going on within the Talmud about that. Well, the baby isn't doing it. The fetus isn't doing it. It's something else. And yet ultimately, the rabbis still end up coming back to the same point. And here we go. A pursuer does not require a forewarning because forewarning is given only to distinguish between unintentional and intentional sin. So yes, the baby is not actively trying to kill its mother, but it still is in essence doing that. And because of that, the rabbis come back and say, the same may be said about a sewer. Since his malice is clear, he does not require forewarning. His sin is obviously intentional. So even though it's coming from the heavens, it's as if it's coming from this fetus, and therefore an abortion is the only thing that can be done. It's kind of a roundabout way of getting to things, but that's how Maimonides understands this topic. Any questions or comments on that? Because I know it's hard to wrap our brains around.
I wanted to say something. I don't know how to put that little hand up on the computer thing yet, but so the way I'm thinking is that, this whole discussion is maybe points to the beauty of Reform Judaism versus, let's say, Orthodoxy, in that, in the 21st century, and before, we've got cesarean sections, we've got other means for having the baby born, right? And we all, prior to the 9 months it ordinarily takes. And so we don't have to abide by Maimonides or any of these rabbis from hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. It's happening, and it's today's Judaism and our lives today. Even though these are interesting comments, it's what I'm thinking of is our lives today, not in the past.
Yeah, and I don't think that you're actually talking about Orthodoxy versus Reform Judaism. Maimonides wrote this, right, in the 12th century.
Okay.
So this was a long time ago. That's about there's been a lot of medical advances over the past 900,000 years, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just was talking about our ability possibly our ability in Reform Judaism to kind of go with the flow and make changes that abide by our lives as they exist now.
Yeah. And well, right now what we're doing is we're looking at these texts to kind of understand some of the values that are underneath them.
Okay.
I'm looking in the chat as well, and there's a question about C-sections to save the baby and mother. Certainly, everyone is in agreement that if there is a way to save a baby and the mother,
right,
that should absolutely be done. These are the cases in which it wasn't possible to do that. And I don't know when C-section started being something that was medically possible, but here at the time of Maimonides, it was saying if the only way to save a mother's life is for the mother to have an abortion, that has to be the way you go. That's the context in which he's talking.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so
I think the major part of the argument is, though, when does Judaism consider, and it's not stated that I know, too late to abort a child? Are they waiting for the crowning of the head? That's all I read. But I don't think anybody today would be in favor of a late-term abortion. I mean, I don't deny the person's right to get it, but I don't think anybody would want to see a healthy fetus aborted in the late stages. So in Judaism, it's still only when the baby is seen, head is seen, and expected to be alive, that they say an abortion can still take place. That's pretty late in the procedure.
So Irv, we're going to get to that a little bit later. So hold on just a second. Yeah, Misty.
No, I was trying to raise my hand, not clap. So sorry about that. I think what's interesting is that if we were to look at this from the perspective of the Word of God versus the commentary, the sages and the rabbis and their writings, it's not necessarily coming from the Word of God, but it's coming more from experience. Am I correct?
Well, what does that mean, the Word of God? Okay, because in the Torah, the only things that we have in the Torah is that one text from Exodus that we just looked into, right?
Correct.
Is that what's meant by the Word of God? It's hard to know what God's word is.
Okay. So, when I look at the Hebrew Bible, I always think of that as the Word of God, which is different than most interpretations that I've been hearing. I guess from Reformed Judaism, it's more the inspired Word of God written through man. I mean, but so the commentaries, they're the interpretations or their reasoning is not based on that one text that we came out of in Genesis.
It's based on a number of different texts from a number of different places. Now, Maimonides himself, in addition to being a rabbi and a learned scholar, he actually was a doctor as well. So there is no doubt that some of his knowledge as a doctor played into his comments.
Correct. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we're all trying to grapple to understand what is God's will here, and we don't know. And so all we can do is go back to the core of the teachings that we have and to wrestle with them. All of these texts from the Talmud in different places, what they do is they take bits of understanding of values within Judaism, of text from different places from within the Tanakh, and try to make sense of them, just as we are. There's this one line that I included in here just so that we would have it, that her life, meaning the mother's life, comes before that of the child, and being able to see that from the Mishnah, which is a 1st, 2nd century text. But I want to come back to some other ideas, which we'll get to what Irv was talking about a few moments ago, which is this idea of the fetus still being sacred. And this is going back to the book of Genesis. Really, I'm looking at this one text verse in the middle. It says, "Whoever sheds human blood, by human's hands shall that one's blood be shed. For in the image of God was humankind made." And this text will show up in this Talmud text a little bit later, where we're grappling with the idea of the fetus's status. So in the name of Rabbi Ishmael, it said, "A descendant of Noah is executed even for killing fetuses." The Gemara asks, what is the reason for the opinion of Rabbi Ishmael? The Gemara answers, it is derived from that which is written, "One who sheds the blood of a person, by a person his blood shall be shed." So here we have a pushing back, right? Here's a sacred being. Here Noah is, or a descendant of Noah is being held for killing even a fetus, because it's a shedding of blood of some kind. The word ba-adam literally means in a person. That word ba, right? Ba means in. So it's showing up there. They're saying it's not by happenstance that the Hebrew is exactly like that. It's not just talking about a person in general. It's also saying in a person, meaning a fetus that is in a person. So in a person, it is interpreted homiletically. What is a person that is in a person? You must say, this is a fetus that is in its mother's womb. Accordingly, a descendant of Noah is liable for killing a fetus. So what this text is essentially pointing out is an abortion is not something to be taken lightly, right? This isn't something that should just be pursued on a whim. This still is a sacred being. And so there needs to be a really important reason. And that's part of why Maimonides stretched it out a bit and said, well, the only reason that I can think of is if a mother's life is in jeopardy, because the mother takes precedence. But there's going to be a few other ideas here as well. So one other text from Sanhedrin 91b, this is also Talmud. And Antonio said to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, "From when is the soul placed in a person? It is from the moment of conception or from the moment of the formation of the embryo 40 days after conception?" Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said to him, "It is from the moment of formation of the embryo." Antonio said to him, "That is inconceivable. Is it possible that a piece of meat could stand for even 3 days without salt as a preservative and would not rot? The embryo could not exist for 40 days without a soul. Rather, the soul is placed in man from the moment of conception." Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said that Antonius taught me this matter, and there is a verse that supports him. As it is said, "Your providence has preserved my spirit. indicating that it is from the moment of conception that the soul is preserved within a person. And said to Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, from where does the evil inclination dominate a person? It is from the moment of the formation of the embryo or from the moment of his emergence from the womb. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi said to him, it is from the moment of the formation of the embryo. And Tonino said to him, if so, the evil inclination will cause the fetus to kick his mother's innards and emerge from the womb. Rather, the evil inclination dominates a person from the moment of emergence from the womb. Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi said, and Toninos taught me this matter, and there is a verse that supports him. Okay, so we're going to stop right there. Essentially what it's saying, right, is that this fetus has something that is sacred, has some sort of a soul, even early on in pregnancy. But their full being, the Yetzer Hara, that which makes a person an individual in a lot of ways, is not something that is fully within a fetus until they are born. So yeah, Jay, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say this quote confused, this statement confused me a little bit, because I was always taught that a person, when they come out of the womb, God breathes life into them. I believe that's what the saying was.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's when I always thought that's when the soul came into life, was when that occurred. So this statement sort of confuses me a little bit as to maybe what I was taught was not exactly right.
Yeah, well, here's the thing, right? I said 2 Jews, 3 opinions. And so we have conflicting ideas within our tradition, and we have to be honest about that there are these conflicting ideas. So it's important to note that there's a tradition that a baby does not receive their name until their 8th day of life, right? Why? Because we don't know if that baby is truly viable. It's as if that baby becomes a baby after, not only after the baby is born, but in some ways, even after a little bit of time has passed, and we know that that baby has made it through their first days. That's a Jewish idea as well. So we definitely have this kind of struggle. This text from Sanhedrin, I would say, is a minority opinion. We have minority and majority opinions. Jay, what you brought forth about the soul being in a human being after they're born, that would be the majority view within Judaism, but we preserve the minority ones as well.
Okay, good.
That makes me feel better.
Yeah, I feel better too.
I just wanted to give a larger breadth because you might only hear a little piece of different ideas within Judaism. I think it's really important to be exposed to more. Okay, so let's look at Rashi. I'm looking at the time, and yes, definitely need to dive into Rashi. So Rashi said its head came out with a woman that is experiencing difficulty giving birth and is in mortal danger. And it is taught in the first section of this teaching, the midwife extends her hands and cuts it up and extracts pieces, as the entire time that has not gone out into the air of the world and not considered a soul. And so it is possible to kill it to save its mother. So that's getting to exactly what you said, Jay, right? The soul is not in this fetus at this point, not until it's born. And because there's no soul in the fetus, if a woman's life is in danger, the woman takes precedence. That's what Rashi is saying, okay? But when his head came out, we can't touch it because then it is a baby. And that life is very, very sacred. Okay, let me look to see how much more text I have here. All right, probably more than I should. One more, let's see. So this is a Mishnah. Yeah, so Kim, you ask a good question here, and you're right. These texts don't say anything about rape or incest, although certainly they should be on our minds, but they don't show up within these texts. And you said wondering if somehow the baby is cut up while in the womb, or do they do a C-section? So this cutting up is referring to getting the baby out. It's referring to an abortion. It's referring to just working to save the mother's life in case where that is necessary. Not that anyone wants that. This is a case where the mother will not survive unless this happens. That's what it's talking about here. Okay, let's look at Arachin. In the case of a pregnant woman who is taken by the court to be executed, the court does not wait to execute her until she gives birth. Rather, she's killed immediately. But with regard to a woman taken to be executed who sat on the travailing chair in the throes of labor, the court waits to execute her until she gives birth. So according to this idea, what it's saying is the fetus doesn't have enough status for the woman to carry through the pregnancy if she is to be executed for some reason. But if the fetus is very close to being born and becoming a baby, then you wait and you have the baby born. Continues, in the case of a woman who is killed through court-imposed capital punishment, one must derive benefit from her hair. Actually, we're going to skip that piece. Okay, the Gemara then, which is the Talmud, expands upon the Mishnah and says, isn't it obvious that the court executes the pregnant woman rather than waiting? After all, it is part of her body. The Gemara answers, it was necessary for the Mishnah to teach this, as it might enter your mind to say that since it is written, and if men strive together and hurt a woman with child so that her offspring depart, he shall be fined, as the woman's husband place upon him. So that's referring back to that earlier text that we read at the very beginning, right? The fetus is considered to be the property of the husband. If so, the court should wait until she gives birth before executing her and not cause him to lose the fetus. Consequently, the Mishnah teaches us that the court does not take this factor into account. So earlier on, what we said was the man has full ownership over this fetus. Through this text in the Talmud, it's saying, no, actually, that's not always the case. It is part of the woman's body. And so this text ends up being used to make a different kind of argument. The rabbis argue that this text demonstrates that an abortion should be allowed if carrying to term will cause the mother psychological harm. How do you think they come to this conclusion? And do you agree?
Are you looking for an answer?
Yeah.
Well, I think this is largely at the crux of the abortion issue, in that oftentimes, I mean, that is the reason someone chooses to have an abortion, because they can't psychologically handle being a mother for whatever reason. There could be many reasons. As to how they come to this conclusion, I'm not sure about that, but I think that's up to the woman to decide. Which brings us back to the issue of pro-choice.
Yeah. So you're right. They do not define psychological harm. These are later kind of rabbinic understandings based on this text, and there's disagreement as to what psychological harm means. But the way that they get to it is saying, like, let's say a mother is going to be killed. The idea that a woman would have to go through an entire pregnancy knowing that at the end of that pregnancy she'll be killed and the baby will grow up without her is such an immense psychological problem to put on this mother that it was something that was not deemed acceptable. And so this is then used to say, well, are there other circumstances in which making a woman carry out a pregnancy could cause psychological harm, such as rape and incest, or severe mental illness, or needing to go off life-saving medications or medications used for mental health in order to be able to carry a fetus to term. Those are the kind of things that rabbis then begin talking about, because there isn't another entree into that through other texts in the Torah. So there's so much more to discuss here. I know I've thrown tons of ideas at you, but the last thing that I want to bring in is this short piece. And this is actually from the Social Justice Commentary, which came out from CCAR Press a year ago, and says, because Jewish law permits abortion under certain circumstances as a morally acceptable choice, or even in some cases as a halakhic requirement, any law that limits a woman's rights to choose might limit a Jewish woman's ability to make a decision in accordance with her religious beliefs. When a people of faith seek to adopt laws asserting when life begins, they endeavor to enshrine their own religious understanding into law. And so we here in this call, in this Torah study today, we might all have different perspectives based on these texts and our own experiences. It's not our job to tell someone else what they should or shouldn't believe, or what they should or shouldn't do in impossible circumstances. But the crux of it is really that no one should have the right to do that. Not a court, not anyone of another faith, that we all should have the right to make decisions in line with our religious and ethical morals and our own individual religious teachings. And I pray that with time and hard work, we'll live in a country in which that is possible once again. So thank you so much for being part of the discussion, for asking so many wonderful questions. I apologize if I was a little all over the place. I've been struggling with a migraine this entire class, but I am so grateful to all of you for being here, and I look forward to continuing to wrestle with these important issues of our time with all of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.